A woman is running late for Shabbat services with her 2 young sons. It's about to rain. In less than 60 seconds, she'll be dead, and she'll spend 2 weeks somewhere else entirely before she comes back. This episode isn't about UFOs or cryptids, as much as I love both. It's about lightning, and a place one woman says she visited in the minutes she was clinically dead. I'm Tim Stone, an author and attorney in New York, and this is Catskill Liminal Walk. The book is a collaboration between 2 very different people. Elizabeth Krohn is the woman it happened to, a Houston wife and mother with no particular interest in the paranormal before that evening. Jeff Kripal is a historian of religion at Rice University, one of the most respected scholars of mysticism and the paranormal in academia. Kripal didn't write this as proof of anything. He wrote it because Krohn's case is unusually well documented, unusually detailed, and, in his view, unusually important, not just as a story of dying, but as a story of what a near-death experience did to the rest of her life. Afterward, Krohn described new abilities, seeing auras, precognitive dreams, a shift in how she viewed the world and felt other people's pain. That's the spine of the whole book. Decades of a life reorganized around one flash of lightning. Tonight's episode covers one part of that story, the place Elizabeth Krohn says she found herself in the minutes she was dead. We're not going to try and capture that fuller story tonight. The years of change, the scholarship Kripal built around it, that's much richer and much longer than one video can hold. What we want to sit with is the catalyst itself and the world in which she woke up. Krohn was 28. It was a Friday, the death anniversary of her grandfather, whose name was to be read aloud at services that evening. Her husband was out of town on business, so she was driving her 2 young sons, 4 and 2 years old, to the synagogue. They were running late, and as she turned into the parking lot, a single thunderhead blotted out what had been a sunny day. It began to pour. She parked a few hundred feet from the door. She sent her older son running ahead alone to the awning and told him to wait there. Then she climbed into the back, got her toddler out of his car seat, took his hand in hers, and grabbed her umbrella for the walk-in to the synagogue. That's an image that's resonated with me since I read this book a few years ago. The image of Elizabeth and her young son leaving the car, jumping out into the rain, and entering a brave new world. What follows is Elizabeth Krohn's account, as she's described it for over 30 years. Elizabeth was struck in 2 stages. A sliver of lightning branched off a larger fork and hit the tip of her umbrella first, freezing her hand around the shaft so she couldn't let go. Then the main bolt hit. She had no pulse. Both her eardrums burst, along with her 2-year-old sons. Bystanders and, shortly after, an unusually large number of physicians who happened to be attending services that evening rushed to help. By any clinical measure, for a period of time, Elizabeth Krohn was dead. This is where the story splits into 2 tracks. On one track, a body in the rain in a synagogue parking lot, being worked on by strangers. On the other track, somewhere else entirely. Krohn describes hovering just above the scene, seeing her own body crumpled on the wet pavement below, and, as strange as it sounds, seeing herself simultaneously standing perfectly fine in the synagogue lobby, feet not touching the floor. 2 versions of herself at once. And she says the moment she understood she wasn't getting up was the moment it hit her. She was dead. This out-of-body experience is one of the most consistently reported aspects of near-death experiences across cultures and centuries. Next, everything about Elizabeth's rigid worldview begins to dissolve. If you've gotten this far in the video, it'd mean a lot to me if you'd consider hitting like, subscribe, or even commenting on the video. Krohn describes a warm, golden glow appearing off to her upper right. Not a fixed point like a light bulb or the sun, but something more like a moving beacon, without hard edges, that seemed to want her to follow it. Knowing her children were safe, she says she gave in and let it draw her forward. She says that as she followed it, her sense of time itself broke apart. Events that should have happened one after another were suddenly happening all at once. The glow led her to a place she calls simply the garden. She describes a bench of hand-carved wooden scrollwork, sanded and polished until it looked and felt like satin, ornate enough to resemble an antique throne built for two. The moment she sat down, she says, the bench itself seemed to shift and conform to her body. Surrounding the bench was an abundance of plants unlike anything on Earth. Flowers blooming into colors, and light, she says, came from some spectrum we simply don't have access to here. And then, she says, a voice, warm, familiar, unmistakably her grandfather's, down to the French accent she'd known her whole life. He had died the year before. The anniversary of his death was the very reason she'd been on her way to the synagogue that evening. His voice told her that hearing him aloud would disrupt her absorption of her surroundings. So, instead, he would speak to her the rest of the way without words, mind to mind. Krohn is careful about this part. She doesn't actually believe the voice belonged to her grandfather. She thinks it was another entity or power entirely, that it was using the voice to ease her into something that would have otherwise been entirely overwhelming for her. She describes being wrapped in a feeling of unconditional love, coming from every direction at once, carried in the scent of the flowers, in the sound of a brook somewhere nearby, in music she couldn't place a source for. She says she felt, for the first time, more alive than she had ever been in her 28 years on Earth. And in the distance, behind where she sat, she describes a mountain range, their edges lit from behind by that same golden glow that had first called her forward. She says everything in her wanted to keep walking toward those mountains, toward the light behind them. But the peace of the bench, the garden, and the presence behind her were enough to want to stay exactly where she was. Krohn said she wasn't the only person there. Scattered in the distance, she could make out other human forms. Every one of them, she says, paired with a companion of their own, the way she was paired with the voice beside her on the bench. No one was alone. She noticed something else, too. Everyone she could see appeared young, healthy, and, in her word, perfect. Looking down at her own hand, the hand that had been holding a metal umbrella shaft seconds before, she found it unmarked. No burns, no wedding ring. The smooth, unlined hand of a much younger woman. Krohn speculates that this place doesn't look the same to everyone who arrives, that it changes based on what's most comforting to that individual person. For Krohn, it was a garden. Different landscapes, same destination. If you've watched my episodes about Betty Andreasson, some of this may sound familiar. Betty's account began with an abduction. Elizabeth Krohn's account began with a lightning strike. Two completely different kinds of physical trauma, but each seems to have knocked its subject through the same kind of proverbial door. An abduction, a lightning bolt. On paper, nothing connects them, but push past the trauma in each case, and both women describe arriving at something that stops registering as physical and starts registering as spiritual. A being of light, communication without words, imagery reached for in religious terms because no other language fit. Andreasson and Krohn never met. Their stories share no source. And yet, on the other side of two very different kinds of violence done to the body, they arrive in strikingly similar territory. By her account, this conversation with the presence beside her lasted what felt like 2 full weeks, even though, back in the parking lot, only a couple of minutes were passing. She says she tracked the time by watching 3 brilliant violet orbs moving slowly overhead, like moons, functioning as a kind of calendar for a place where clocks don't otherwise apply. In that time, she says she was given a choice, stay or return. And she says she was given pieces of information to help her decide, some of it sweeping, about the nature of time and reincarnation, some of it extremely specific, like details about a future presidential election and a Super Bowl matchup, offered less as trivia and more as proof she could hold on to later, back on Earth. What tipped the decision, she says, were her children, the 2 she had, and a third her guide told her she hadn't had yet, a future daughter. She was told that her daughter, the soul of that child, had already selected Elizabeth and her husband as parents, but that this should not sway her decision. If she decided to stay in eternity, the child would simply choose different parents and the womb of a different woman. Krohn writes that she immediately understood that reincarnation is a fact, despite never having believed in it. Reincarnation was a topic to which I had previously not given much, if any, thought. Had I thought about it, I would have laughed it off as impossible. But suddenly I knew it to be a very real process. Elizabeth chose to return, wanting to raise her children. The return itself, she says, was nothing like the peace of the garden. Her guide warned her it would hurt, that her soul had grown too large in that place to simply slip back into her body, and that returning would feel like being crushed back into it. She said that's exactly what it felt like. She woke on the wet asphalt, gasping, her arms still frozen around the shape of an umbrella that was no longer there. Burns on her feet and left hand. Injuries she hadn't felt at all in the garden were suddenly, fully hers. This is a single thread in a much bigger book. A single visit to a single garden. What Krohn says happened to her in the years since, the precognitive dreams, the auras she sees, the total reorientation of her worldview, a single video can't do that justice. The book tells a much broader, richer story. This episode was only about the place itself, the bench, the flowers, the mountains in the distance, and the 2 weeks she says she spent there before choosing to come back. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Catskill Liminal Walk. I do welcome your comments with feedback in the comment section about this episode, as well as ideas for future episodes. I hope to see you again.